Some doors do not change your life when they open. They change it while they are still closed. Emily Carter stood in the polished marble lobby of Brooks Dynamics with her portfolio pressed tightly against her chest, silently repeating the same sentence she had practiced nearly 100 times since sunrise. She could not afford to fail today. Not because this was the perfect job, but because she had promised someone very important that she would come home smiling no matter what happened. Her phone vibrated softly inside her blazer pocket. She glanced down and saw a message from Mrs. Henderson, the retired neighbor watching 5-year-old Sophie while she attended the interview. A photo appeared beneath the text. Sophie sat at the kitchen table wearing oversized pink pajamas, hugging a stuffed rabbit almost as big as her tiny body. She smiled brightly at the camera while holding up a piece of paper covered with uneven crayons. Across the page, written in careful block letters with obvious help from an adult, were the words, "Good luck, Mommy." Emily felt her throat tighten. She smiled despite the weight pressing against her heart, locked her phone, and whispered almost silently, "I will make you proud." She stepped toward the elevator just as the stainless steel doors slid open with a quiet chime. The spacious elevator was nearly empty. Only one man stood inside, dressed in an impeccably tailored navy suit that fit with effortless precision. His posture was relaxed. His expression was calm. He carried no briefcase, no stack of papers, and no visible hurry despite the early morning rush surrounding the building. Emily offered a polite smile before stepping inside and moving toward the opposite corner. The doors closed. The elevator began its smooth climb. Emily glanced once toward the illuminated floor numbers before taking a slow breath. She believed she was simply sharing the ride with another employee heading to work. The silence felt almost comforting. She carefully opened her portfolio and looked down at the interview notes she had rewritten 3 different times the previous night after Sophie had finally fallen asleep. Her lips moved quietly at first. "Tell us about yourself." She stopped and shook her head. "No, too rehearsed." She tried again. "My name is Emily Carter. I have several years of administrative experience and—" She sighed softly. "Too formal." She closed her eyes for a second, forgetting she was not alone. "Just tell the truth," she whispered to herself. "You can do this." The man standing across from her remained silent, respectfully looking toward the elevator doors instead of interrupting. Emily took another breath. "I stepped away from my career because life asked something different from me. Becoming a mother taught me organization, patience, resilience, and responsibility in ways no office ever could." She paused again, quietly embarrassed by the sound of her own voice echoing through the elevator. "That sounds terrible." She laughed nervously under her breath. "Nobody is going to believe that." She lowered her head and rubbed the edge of her resume between trembling fingers before trying one last time without reading anything. "I am not asking anyone to ignore the gap on my resume. I am asking them to see everything I learned while I was living inside it." The words surprised even her. They had not been written anywhere. They simply appeared. She stared at the reflection in the polished elevator wall, speaking now not to an interviewer, but to herself. "My daughter deserves to grow up believing her mother never stopped trying." Her voice became quieter. She deserves to see her mother stand back up. The silence that followed seemed heavier than before. Emily suddenly remembered she was not alone. Color rushed into her face as she slowly turned toward the man across from her. "I am so sorry," she said with an embarrassed smile. "I did not realize I was saying all of that out loud." For the first time since entering the elevator, the stranger looked directly at her. His calm blue eyes held neither amusement nor pity, only quiet understanding. A small, reassuring smile appeared. "Actually," he said gently, "I think that was the strongest answer you have given so far." Emily blinked, caught completely off guard by the unexpected encouragement from someone she believed she would never see again. Above them, a tiny security camera continued recording every second of the conversation that neither of them yet realized would quietly change far more than one interview. Emily felt some of the tension leave her shoulders as she let out an embarrassed laugh. "That is very kind of you," she said, "although I am not sure the hiring manager would agree." The man smiled slightly, but did not answer immediately. Instead, he glanced once at the neatly organized folder in her hands before looking back toward the elevator doors. "May I ask you something?" he said in a calm voice. Emily hesitated for only a second before nodding. "Of course." If someone interviewing you focused more on your employment gap than everything you learned during it, what would you hope they understood? Emily looked down at the edge of her resume, gently smoothing a corner that was already perfectly straight. I would hope they understood that life is not always a straight line. She smiled faintly. Sometimes people step away because they stop caring. Sometimes they step away because someone else needs them more. The stranger listened without interrupting. Emily continued quietly. When my daughter was born, I thought I would only be away from work for a little while. Then medical appointments became school registrations. Late nights became early mornings, and every plan I made changed. She looked toward the glowing floor numbers above the doors. I never stopped wanting to build a career. I just had someone who depended on me more than any employer ever could. The man nodded thoughtfully. Would you change that decision if you could? Emily answered almost instantly. Never. Then she smiled. I might change the amount of sleep I got during those years. The stranger laughed softly. It was warm, genuine, and surprisingly ordinary. Emily found herself relaxing a little more. There was something comforting about talking to someone who asked questions without making her feel judged. May I ask you something now? She said. Please. Do you work here? He gave a small nod. I do. Long time. Long enough to have learned a few things. Emily smiled politely. Then maybe you can answer something honestly. I will try. She took a slow breath. Do companies really mean it when they say they value people? Or is that just something printed on career websites? The question lingered between them for a moment. The man did not rush his answer. Some companies mean it, he finally replied. Others believe they mean it until they become too busy to notice the people standing in front of them. Emily quietly considered those words. They sounded less like an opinion and more like experience. Before she could respond, her phone vibrated again. She immediately unlocked the screen. Another message from Mrs. Henderson appeared. Emily's smile faded as she read it. Sophie woke up saying her head hurt. She feels warm. I checked her temperature. It is 100.1 degrees. She is resting now, but I wanted you to know. Emily stared at the screen for several long seconds. Her fingers tightened around the phone before she quickly typed back, Thank you. Please let her rest. I will call as soon as my interview is finished. She slipped the phone back into her pocket, hoping the stranger had not noticed the sudden change in her expression. He had. Everything all right? He asked gently. Emily forced a reassuring smile that did not quite reach her eyes. My daughter has a slight fever. She quickly added, It is probably nothing serious. Children get sick. She stopped herself before finishing the sentence. You wish you could be in two places at once, the man said quietly. Emily looked at him in surprise. Exactly. For the first time that morning, she felt someone had described her life without needing a long explanation. Neither of them spoke again for several moments as the elevator continued climbing higher through the building. Then, just as Emily glanced once more toward the illuminated floor display, the lights flickered almost imperceptibly. The elevator gave a gentle shudder before coming to a complete stop between two floors. Silence settled over the small space. Emily instinctively looked toward the closed doors, then back at the stranger. Somewhere above them, the soft mechanical hum disappeared, leaving only the sound of their breathing inside the suddenly motionless elevator. Emily instinctively tightened her grip on her portfolio as the elevator settled into complete stillness. The sudden silence felt louder than the quiet mechanical hum that had filled the ride only moments earlier. She looked up at the glowing floor display, but the numbers had frozen. Her heartbeat quickened. Please do not be today, she whispered before she could stop herself. The stranger remained remarkably calm. Without showing even the slightest sign of frustration, he pressed the emergency call button beside the control panel. A soft chime answered almost immediately. This is building operations, a pleasant voice said through the speaker. We are aware of the interruption. Please remain calm. We are restarting the elevator system now. It may take several minutes. Thank you, the man replied in an even tone. There are 2 passengers. Everything is under control. Emily noticed that his voice carried quiet confidence without sounding demanding. When the call ended, she let out a slow breath she had not realized she had been holding. I cannot believe this is happening, she said with an uneasy smile. Out of every morning, life rarely checks our schedules before making changes, the stranger replied gently. Emily laughed despite herself. That sounds like something my father used to say. She looked down at her watch. Every passing minute felt heavier than the last. The interview was getting closer, and Sophie was waiting at home with a fever. Two responsibilities pulled at her heart from opposite directions. She unlocked her phone again. There was still no new message. Relief lasted only a second before another worry appeared. What if Mrs. Henderson needed to leave? What if Sophie's fever climbed? What if she missed the interview anyway? She quietly closed her eyes. The stranger watched her expression carefully before speaking again. You are thinking about your daughter. Emily nodded. She always comes first. Even today? Emily looked directly at him. Especially today. There was no hesitation in her voice. Getting this job matters because of her. If she needs me, there is no decision to make. The man seemed to consider that answer longer than she expected. Finally, he asked, have you ever regretted choosing family over opportunity? Emily smiled sadly. Opportunity comes back in different forms. Childhood does not. The words lingered inside the small elevator. The stranger slowly folded his hands in front of him. That is not an answer everyone would give. Maybe not, Emily admitted. But my daughter will never remember what position I held. She will remember whether I showed up when she needed me. A faint smile crossed the man's face, almost as though he recognized something he had not heard in years. A moment later, his own phone vibrated. He glanced briefly at the screen before placing it back into his pocket without replying. Emily noticed dozens of notifications had appeared, but he ignored every one of them without a second thought. That surprised her. Most executives she had met, while working years earlier, seemed unable to go 30 seconds without answering an email. You are not going to answer that? She asked. It can wait. It looked important. He smiled lightly. People often believe everything is urgent. Very little actually is. Emily studied him for a second. There was something unusual about the way he carried himself. His expensive suit suggested success, yet there was no arrogance in his posture. His answers were thoughtful, almost careful, as though he measured people differently than most. Before she could ask another question, the emergency speaker crackled once more. Thank you for your patience, the operator announced. We are restoring power now. The elevator lights brightened for an instant, then steadied. The floor indicator blinked back to life. Emily smiled with visible relief, expecting the elevator to continue upward immediately. Instead, the stranger turned slightly toward her and asked one more question in the same calm voice that had followed her since the doors first closed. If keeping your job required staying silent while someone else was treated unfairly, what would you choose? Emily stared at him, realizing this was no ordinary conversation, and before she answered, the elevator remained perfectly still, as though even the building itself was waiting to hear her response. Emily did not answer immediately. She looked at the frozen floor indicator above the doors, then back at the man standing across from her. His question felt strangely personal, almost as if he was not asking about a hypothetical situation at all. She drew in a careful breath. I would like to believe I would speak up, she said at last, even if it cost me the job. The stranger held her gaze without saying a word. Emily smiled faintly. That probably sounds idealistic. Does it? He asked. Most people have bills to pay. I certainly do. She lowered her eyes for a moment. But if I came home one day knowing I stayed quiet while someone else was treated unfairly, I would eventually have to explain that choice to my daughter. She asks difficult questions. A small laugh escaped her. Children usually do. Emily nodded. She notices everything. If I tell her to be honest, then I have to be honest. If I tell her to stand up for people, then I have to do the same. Otherwise, those are just words. The elevator remained motionless, leaving only the soft sound of the ventilation system filling the silence between them. The stranger finally spoke again. Have you always thought that way? Emily smiled thoughtfully. No. Life taught me. She rested one hand lightly against the portfolio she still carried. When everything is going well, values are easy. You never have to choose between what is comfortable and what is right. It is only when you are scared that you find out which one matters more. The man looked at her with quiet curiosity. You have been scared before. She let out a slow breath. More than once. She did not elaborate, and he did not press for details. Instead, he asked another question. Why this company? Emily answered almost immediately. Because every person I talked to before applying said the same thing. Which was that people here are expected to solve problems instead of protecting their titles. She smiled apologetically. I do not know if that is actually true. Companies all have beautiful mission statements. The stranger tilted his head slightly. And if it is not true, Emily shrugged gently. Then I will keep looking until I find somewhere that is. She paused before adding, I am not searching for a perfect workplace. I am searching for one where people are still seen as people. Those words lingered in the quiet space. The stranger slowly slipped one hand into his pocket and looked toward the closed elevator doors. For the first time since they had met, his expression carried something deeper than simple curiosity. It looked almost reflective. Emily wondered whether she had said something foolish. I talk too much when I am nervous, she admitted with an embarrassed smile. Actually, he replied softly, you answer the question that was asked. That is rarer than you think. Emily laughed. Maybe because I spent all night trying not to memorize perfect answers. Why? Because perfect answers usually sound borrowed. She looked at her reflection in the polished metal wall. Real ones belong to the person saying them. The stranger lowered his eyes briefly, as though those words had reached somewhere unexpectedly personal. His phone vibrated again. This time the screen lit up long enough for Emily to notice several incoming messages arriving almost at once. Once again, he ignored every one of them. Instead, he unlocked the device for only a moment, typed a brief response, and locked it again. Emily could not see what he had written. She only noticed how quickly he finished before giving his full attention back to her. High above them, hidden behind another set of elevator doors several floors away, a conference room filled with executives waited in growing confusion as an assistant quietly informed them that the morning board meeting would begin later than planned. Inside the elevator, Emily knew nothing about delayed meetings, waiting executives, or the decisions being quietly rearranged around her. She believed she was simply speaking with a thoughtful employee during an unexpected delay. The emergency speaker crackled once more. Thank you for your patience, the operator said. The system has been restored. Your elevator will resume movement shortly. A gentle vibration passed beneath their feet. Emily smiled with relief as the elevator finally began moving upward again. Neither of them realized that the most important interview of the morning had already been happening long before the elevator reached its destination. The elevator climbed smoothly again, almost as if the interruption had never happened, but something had changed inside the small space. Emily no longer felt as though she was standing beside a stranger. She still did not know his name, yet the conversation had settled her racing thoughts more than she cared to admit. As the illuminated numbers counted upward, she quietly straightened her blazer and slipped her portfolio under one arm. Thank you, she said sincerely, for listening. The man gave a small nod. Thank you for answering honestly. Emily smiled. I am not sure honesty always helps during interviews. Perhaps not every interview, he replied. But sometimes it tells people far more than polished answers ever could. She looked at him with a curious expression. You ask questions like someone who interviews people often. A faint smile crossed his face. Maybe I have had a little practice. Before Emily could ask anything else, the elevator slowed gently. A soft chime echoed through the cabin as the doors began sliding open onto the executive floor. Bright morning light poured through the glass walls outside, reflecting across polished stone floors. Emily instinctively stepped aside to allow the man to leave first. He remained where he was for a brief moment and turned toward her. One last question, he said. Emily laughed softly. Another one? Just one. She nodded. All right. His expression remained calm, but his eyes carried genuine interest. If you were responsible for hiring someone whose resume was not perfect, what would matter most to you? Emily did not even glance at her folder. She had stopped searching for prepared answers several minutes ago. I would watch how they treat people when they believe no one important is paying attention, she answered. Resumes explain experience. Character explains everything else. The man studied her quietly. And if two candidates had identical qualifications? Emily smiled. Then I would choose the one who made other people feel respected. She paused before adding, skills can grow. Character usually reveals itself long before anyone notices. The elevator doors remained open, waiting. Neither of them seemed in a hurry to step outside. Finally, Emily shifted her portfolio and laughed at herself. I probably sound like someone who has read too many inspirational books. No, the man answered gently. You sound like someone who has lived through enough difficult days to know the difference. For just a second, Emily forgot she was standing inside one of the most prestigious office buildings in the city. She simply felt understood. She smiled with quiet gratitude before stepping toward the open hallway. The moment both of them crossed the threshold, everything changed. A group of sharply dressed executives and department leaders who had been standing several yards away immediately stopped their conversation. Almost in perfect unison, they turned toward the man beside Emily. One of them hurried forward with an apologetic expression. "Good morning, Mr. Brooks," he said respectfully. "We delayed the board meeting as requested. Everyone is waiting whenever you are ready." Another executive extended a tablet. "The revised agenda has been updated, sir." A third person added, "The investors have already arrived." Emily stopped walking. Every sound around her seemed to disappear. She slowly turned toward the man she had spent the last several minutes speaking with, as though he were simply another employee. The pieces fell into place with breathtaking speed. The unanswered messages, the quiet confidence, the thoughtful questions, the delayed meeting. The way building operations had responded immediately. Her eyes widened as recognition settled over her. Ethan Brooks, founder of Brooks Dynamics, billionaire entrepreneur, chief executive officer. The man standing beside her was not an employee offering friendly advice. He was the person whose name appeared on the building, whose signature could change careers with a single decision. Emily felt the color drain from her face. "Oh my goodness," she whispered almost soundlessly. I did not know." Ethan Brooks looked at her with the same calm expression he had worn since the elevator doors first closed. He offered neither amusement nor superiority, only a quiet smile that somehow made the crowded executive hallway feel less intimidating. "I know," he said gently. "That is exactly why our conversation mattered." Emily felt the warmth rush into her face as every conversation in the hallway seemed to fade into the background. Only moments earlier she had spoken freely, laughed awkwardly, admitted her fears, and confessed things she would never have planned to say during a formal interview. Now she realized every word had been spoken to the founder of the company she hoped would give her a second chance. "Mr. Brooks," she said quietly, struggling to find the right words. "I am so sorry if I was unprofessional." Ethan Brooks looked at her for a brief moment before shaking his head. "You were honest," he replied. "There is a difference." Emily lowered her eyes. "I should have recognized you." "Why?" he asked calmly. She blinked in surprise. Because everyone knows who you are." A faint smile appeared on his face. Apparently not everyone. A few executives standing nearby exchanged polite smiles, but none interrupted. They seemed accustomed to waiting for him, even when important meetings were delayed. Emily tightened her grip on her portfolio. "I spoke too much." "You answered questions." "I spoke about my daughter." "You did." "I spoke about my career." "Yes." Emily sighed softly. "I probably said things I should have saved for the interview." Ethan's expression remained composed. "Why would you regret telling the truth?" She hesitated. "Because now it might look as though I was trying to gain sympathy." He answered immediately. "You could not have been. You did not know who I was." The simple logic of his response caught her off guard. For the first time since stepping out of the elevator, she felt her shoulders relax slightly. Ethan glanced toward the executives waiting several feet away before returning his attention to her. "Miss Carter." Hearing her last name from him made the moment feel unexpectedly formal. "Yes, sir." "When you stepped into that elevator, what were you expecting?" Emily smiled nervously. "A difficult interview." "And what did you find instead?" She looked at him for a second before quietly answering. "Someone willing to listen." Ethan nodded almost imperceptibly. Listening is often the first responsibility of leadership. Those words seemed directed at no one in particular, yet several executives standing nearby lowered their eyes thoughtfully. Emily noticed it without fully understanding why. She quickly remembered the time. "I should not keep everyone waiting." She took a small step backward. "Thank you for your kindness, Mr. Brooks." Ethan inclined his head. "Your interview begins in 12 minutes. Emily looked surprised. "I should probably review my notes one last time." "That is your choice," he said. "But if I may offer one suggestion, please, do not replace the answers I heard today with rehearsed ones." Emily looked down at the folder in her hands. The pages suddenly felt heavier than they had an hour earlier. Every carefully memorized sentence now seemed less important than the conversation that had happened while the elevator stood motionless between two floors. She slowly closed the portfolio. "I think I understand." Ethan smiled faintly. "Good." An assistant approached carefully. "Sir, the board is ready whenever you are." Ethan acknowledged him with a slight nod before turning back toward Emily one final time. Whatever happens today, he said, walk into that room exactly as the person who walked into the elevator this morning. Emily held his gaze. Even if I am nervous? Especially then. She smiled for the first time since learning his identity. Thank you. Ethan watched as she turned toward the reception area at the end of the executive hallway. She walked with steadier steps now, though she still had no expectation beyond earning a fair opportunity. As Emily disappeared around the corner, one of the senior vice presidents quietly stepped closer to Ethan. Sir, he said carefully, should the interview panel receive any special instructions regarding Miss Carter? Ethan looked toward the hallway where she had vanished only seconds earlier. His answer came without hesitation. None. He paused before adding in the same calm voice, treat her exactly like every other candidate. The executive nodded respectfully. Ethan then looked through the glass wall overlooking the city skyline, his reflection staring back at him, for reasons he could not yet fully explain. The conversation inside an ordinary elevator had reminded him of something he had spent years building a company around and far too little time protecting. Emily sat quietly outside the interview room with her portfolio resting on her lap, but for the first time that morning, she did not open it. The carefully prepared notes that had occupied so many late nights suddenly felt less important than the conversation she had shared inside the elevator. She closed the folder completely and rested both hands on top of it. Around her, several other candidates reviewed printed resumes, whispered practice answers under their breath, or scrolled through company information on their phones. Emily simply breathed slowly and remembered Ethan's words. Walk into that room exactly as the person who walked into the elevator this morning. A receptionist stepped into the waiting area with a warm smile. Miss Emily Carter? Emily stood immediately. Yes. The interview panel is ready for you. Emily thanked her and followed the receptionist through a quiet hallway lined with photographs celebrating decades of company milestones. She noticed smiling employees instead of products on the walls. It was a small detail, but somehow comforting. The conference room doors opened, revealing 3 interviewers seated along one side of a polished wooden table. They greeted her politely and invited her to sit down. Emily thanked each of them before taking her seat, placing her portfolio neatly beside a glass of water. The introductions were friendly but professional. The director of operations asked about her previous administrative experience. Emily answered confidently, explaining how she had coordinated schedules, managed client communication, and supported multiple departments before stepping away from full-time employment. The human resources manager asked about the years missing from her resume. Emily smiled gently instead of apologizing. Those years taught me different kinds of leadership, she said. I learned how to stay organized while life refused to follow a schedule. I learned patience because children do not measure progress in business quarters. Most importantly, I learned that responsibility continues even when nobody is watching. The interviewers exchanged thoughtful glances before writing notes. Another question followed about conflict in the workplace. Emily answered honestly, describing the importance of listening before reacting and solving problems without forgetting the people involved. She noticed the conversation becoming more natural with every answer. She was no longer trying to sound impressive. She was simply explaining who she had become. Then, just as the next interviewer reached for another page, the conference room door opened quietly. Every member of the panel stood at once. Emily turned instinctively. Ethan Brooks entered without ceremony, carrying only a slim notebook in one hand. He greeted the panel with a polite nod before taking the empty chair at the far end of the table. He did not look at Emily immediately. Instead, he thanked the interviewers for their time and motioned for everyone to continue. Emily felt her pulse quicken again, but she remembered his advice and steadied her breathing. The interview resumed. After several more questions, the operations director smiled toward Ethan. Mr. Brooks, would you like to ask the final question? Ethan opened the notebook but did not look at it. His attention settled calmly on Emily. Miss Carter, he began. Why do you believe difficult seasons sometimes produce stronger employees instead of weaker ones? The room became perfectly still. Emily did not search for a rehearsed answer because there was none. She thought about sleepless nights, unpaid bills, school lunches, bedtime stories, and every morning she had chosen hope over fear. She smiled softly before speaking. Because hardship has a way of removing everything that is not essential, she said. When life becomes difficult, You learn what truly matters. You learn to solve problems without waiting for perfect conditions. You learn gratitude for opportunities that once seemed ordinary. Most of all, you learn how important every person is because you know what it feels like to need someone else's kindness. She paused briefly before continuing. My daughter has watched me receive rejection letters after she went to sleep. She has also watched me wake up the next morning and keep trying. If I become part of this company, I hope the skills on my resume will help the team. But I hope the person I became during those difficult years will help even more. Ethan quietly closed his notebook without asking another question. He looked toward the rest of the interview panel and said in an even voice, I believe the remaining questions have already been answered. Silence settled over the conference room after Ethan's final words. No one reached for another question. No one turned another page. The interview panel simply looked at one another as though they all understood the conversation had reached its natural conclusion. The director of operations smiled warmly at Emily. Miss Carter, thank you for your time today. We appreciate your thoughtful answers. Emily nodded gratefully. Thank you for the opportunity. She gathered her portfolio, careful not to rush, then stood from her chair. As she prepared to leave, Ethan spoke once more. Miss Carter, would you mind waiting in the reception lounge for a few minutes? Emily hesitated only briefly. Of course. She offered a polite smile to everyone in the room before quietly walking out. The door closed gently behind her. Left alone, the interview panel exchanged thoughtful glances. The human resources manager was the first to speak. Her technical qualifications meet the requirements, she said. Perhaps not the strongest on paper, but certainly solid. The operations director nodded. Her communication skills are excellent. She listens before answering. That is becoming increasingly rare. Another executive looked toward Ethan. She also carries herself with remarkable composure considering the circumstances. Ethan remained silent for a moment before speaking. What concerns do any of you have? The room became quiet again. Finally, the finance director answered honestly. Only the employment gap. Ethan nodded. Reasonable concern. He folded his hands on the table. Now tell me what that gap actually represents. The room fell silent once more. No one answered immediately. Ethan continued calmly. Does it represent a lack of responsibility, or years spent carrying more responsibility than most people ever experience? No one disagreed. Does it represent someone who stopped growing, or someone whose growth happened outside an office building? The human resources manager smiled slightly. When you put it that way, it becomes difficult to see it as a weakness. Ethan nodded. Because it is not one. He stood and walked toward the large windows overlooking the city below. Her resume earned her an interview. Her character earned something more valuable. Several moments later, Emily looked up from her seat in the reception lounge as the same receptionist approached with a welcoming smile. Miss Carter, they are ready to see you again. Emily rose slowly, her heart beginning to race once more. She had no idea what to expect. She followed the receptionist back into the conference room, where every member of the panel greeted her with warm expressions. Ethan remained standing near the windows before turning toward her. Miss Carter, he began. Thank you for your patience. Emily smiled politely. Thank you for considering my application. Ethan walked back toward the table. I would like to make something very clear before we continue. Emily listened carefully. You are not being offered an opportunity because anyone feels sorry for your circumstances. She felt herself straighten instinctively. I understand. Ethan continued. You are being considered because you demonstrated honesty without expecting a reward, responsibility without seeking recognition, and respect for others even when you believed nobody important was watching. Emily felt emotion rise in her chest, but remained composed. Ethan picked up a folder from the conference table. The position you applied for remains available. He paused before adding. However, I believe you are capable of more than the role described in that job posting. Emily looked at him in surprise. Ethan placed the folder gently in front of her. We would like to offer you the position of operations coordinator, along with enrollment in our leadership development program. You will receive mentoring, professional training, and a clear path for advancement based entirely on your performance. Emily stared at the folder for several seconds before looking back up. Are you certain? She asked quietly. Ethan smiled. Very. Her eyes filled with grateful tears that never fell. She took a careful breath before answering. I will work every day to deserve the confidence you are placing in me. Ethan shook his head gently. You already earned our confidence this morning. He paused, remembering the conversation inside the elevator. Now all you have to do is keep being the person you were before you knew who was listening. 3 weeks later, the morning sun reflected across the glass walls of Brooks Dynamics as employees hurried through the lobby carrying coffee cups, laptops, and conversations about deadlines waiting upstairs. Emily Carter stepped through the front entrance wearing the same navy blazer she had worn on the day of her interview. But this time her shoulders were relaxed, and her smile came naturally. Her employee identification badge rested neatly against her jacket, a quiet reminder that hope sometimes arrived disguised as an ordinary workday. Before heading toward the elevators, she glanced at her phone. A new picture from Mrs. Henderson filled the screen. Sophie stood outside her kindergarten classroom, holding a backpack almost as large as she was, flashing a wide grin with one missing front tooth. Beneath the picture was a short message. She told everyone this morning that her mommy works in the tallest building she has ever seen. Emily laughed softly and whispered, I hope I keep giving you reasons to be proud. She slipped the phone into her pocket and stepped into the elevator. As the doors began to close, a young woman hurried across the lobby. Please hold it. Emily pressed the open door button immediately. The woman stepped inside, breathing quickly while clutching a folder so tightly that several papers slipped onto the floor. I am so sorry, the young applicant said as she bent to gather them. Emily knelt beside her without hesitation and helped collect every page. Big interview? She asked with a warm smile. The woman nodded nervously. I have practiced my answers all week, and now I cannot remember any of them. Emily recognized the look immediately because she had seen it in the mirror only 3 weeks earlier. Can I tell you something? She asked gently. Please. Emily smiled. The people interviewing you already have your resume. They already know your experience. The only thing they cannot read on paper is who you are. The young woman listened carefully. Do not waste your energy trying to sound perfect, Emily continued. Tell the truth. Listen carefully. Answer honestly. People remember sincerity much longer than rehearsed speeches. The applicant smiled with visible relief. Thank you. I really needed to hear that. Emily nodded. So did I once. Neither of them noticed a familiar figure standing quietly near the lobby entrance as the elevator doors closed. Ethan Brooks had paused on his way toward another meeting after recognizing the elevator from across the lobby. He watched through the narrowing gap as Emily encouraged a complete stranger with the same kindness she had shown before anyone knew who she was. He smiled almost imperceptibly before turning toward his assistant. Has the proposal for the Family Support Initiative been finalized? Yes, sir, the assistant replied. The board approved the program yesterday. Flexible scheduling for parents, expanded childcare assistance, return-to-work mentoring, and emergency family leave all begin next month. Ethan looked once more toward the elevator that had already disappeared above them. Good, he said quietly. Make sure every employee knows those resources exist. Of course. Later that afternoon, an email announcing the new initiative reached every inbox across the company. Most employees assumed the changes were simply another example of thoughtful leadership. Only Ethan understood that meaningful change had started inside a quiet elevator when a single mother believed she was speaking to no one important. As Emily finished her first successful month at Brooks Dynamics, she still believed the greatest gift she had received was a new career. Ethan knew the truth was larger than that. One honest conversation had reminded an entire company that resumes may open doors, but character is what invites people to stay. And sometimes the most powerful person in the room is not the one with the highest title, but the one who quietly chooses kindness even when they believe nobody is listening.